What makes a nation? The English philosopher Sir Roger Scruton once said that a nation is so much more than a set of legal documents. A nation is so much more than what you see on your passport. A nation is home, characterized by a shared culture, a shared sense of identity, a shared way of life, a shared language, and a shared sense of collective memory. A nation is not a hotel. It is not a place where you do not know who is living next door, what language they are speaking, what culture they are clinging to, and what history they are part of. A nation is home. But now look at what is happening to my home in the United Kingdom. Look at what is happening to Britain and to England, which looks set to be completely and irreversibly transformed within just one lifetime. Not over a century or two, but everything I'm about to walk you through will happen over just one lifetime, within 74 years. A child born today will live to see all of these changes. For the first time in the history of my country, the historic majority will officially become a minority. The share of our population that is white British will collapse from 74% today to 33% by the end of the century. The share of our population that is foreign born, that is comprised of people who were born outside of the UK and their immediate children, will rise from 19% today to over 60% by the end of this century. The share of people following Islam, if current trends continue, will rise from 1 in every 17 people today to roughly 1 in every 4 by the end of this century, and potentially as high as 1 in every 3 among the under 40s. Islam will soon be the largest and most powerful religion in my country. The signs are already there. In 2023, the name Muhammad officially replaced the name Noah as the most popular boy's name in Britain. I'm not the only person who feels concerned about this, reflected, as you can see, in the success of the book. But last week, according to one reputable pollster in Britain, more than half of all British people now say, "I feel like a stranger in my country because of immigration," a figure that rises to 62% of Conservative Party voters and to 86% of people who are currently planning to vote for Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, which is the #1 party in the national polls today. Interestingly, 1 in 3 black and minority ethnic voters also say, "I feel like a stranger in my country because of immigration." They too associate the nation and their home with the historic majority group, something many people on the left often fail to recognize. What those people can sense is that they are now being subjected to an extreme policy which they never voted for or ever asked for. There is no democratic mandate for mass uncontrolled immigration. At root, this policy is about the demographic replacement of the historic majority group. That is considered taboo in Britain, but if you look at the data and the trends, it is now empirical reality. All nations need a majority group. That is what holds them together. It is what gives nations an anchor, and it is what Sir Roger Scruton once called their delicate spirit. It is what creates the culture. It is what creates the way of life. If you look around the globe today, you will find that most nations have a clearly defined majority group. Roughly 70% of all countries have a large visible majority, while 80% of all countries have a majority group that represents at least 40% of their population. By the end of this century, my country will have neither of those things. Increasingly, it will find itself in the same category as countries such as Sierra Leone and Lebanon, in having no visible, strong majority group, and almost certainly with a politics that has become much more fragmented, unstable, tribal, and polarized. We can already see what is coming. The white British are already a minority in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Leicester, Luton, Slough, and Watford, the town where I was born. Soon, it will also be true in a much larger number of areas, from Blackburn to Coventry, from Nottingham to Oxford, from Bedford to Derby, among many, many more. The white British today only represent 1/3 of London, our capital city. In 2024, only half of all babies born in Britain were white British, down from 83% as recently as 2001. White British children are already a minority in 1 in every 4 schools across the country, including most of London. They make up 19% of nursery pupils in Manchester, 14% in a place like Luton, 5% in a place like Slough. Last year, more than 4 in 10 babies, nearly half, born in Britain had at least one foreign-born parent. Close to 30% had 2 parents who were not born in Britain. The fertility rate in my country, in England and Wales, has collapsed. It is now 1.4. The replacement rate is 2.1. In Scotland, it is 1.2. Mass immigration now accounts for 98% of all population growth in the United Kingdom. Mass immigration accounts for 98% of all population growth in the United Kingdom. No frontline politician in my country is willing to discuss this. Increasingly, our future will be shaped not by British people having children and those children being raised in families with deep roots to the nation, with strong ties to our culture, but by people who often barely know the country at all. People on the left say that none of this is a problem, that we should just celebrate diversity because diversity is who we are. But as even fairly centrist academics such as Francis Fukuyama have argued, to say that a nation is welcoming of diversity is fine, but it cannot be the basis of a nation's identity, because it is the same thing as saying that nation has no identity of its own. If the only thing that defines you is that you celebrate other people, then you don't really exist, which is the point. In reality, what we're witnessing in my country, like I suspect many people are witnessing in other countries in Europe, is the collapse of the pillars that have long underpinned our nations, our Christian values, our shared language, and our sense of shared identity. In 2021, it was officially confirmed that Britain is no longer a majority Christian nation. In only 20 years, the share of Christians in England and Wales collapsed from 72% to 46%. Today, only 1% of Gen Z identify with the Church of England. 1%. 2 groups are now surging, the non-religious and Muslims. Islam is now the fastest growing religion in my country. Muslims comprise 40% of large parts of London, 1/3 of places such as Blackburn, Bradford and Newham, 30% of Birmingham and 1/4 of Manchester. There are many Islamic enclaves in Britain where there is a complete lack of integration and parallel societies. Ed Hussein, a Muslim writer, wrote a fantastic book called Among the Mosques, where he turned up spontaneously to dozens of mosques in the UK. And he made the point that if you are a young Muslim in Britain, you can go your entire day from waking up, going to school, going to mosque, visiting community organizations and shops, visiting your neighbors, and never having any interaction with a member of the non-Muslim majority. The political influence of Islam is growing rapidly. Muslims are already the largest religious group in 20 seats. In 2024, they were the largest minority religion in nearly 60% of our most marginal or our most competitive constituencies. Soon, because of the trends I discuss in the book, they will completely dominate politics in large parts of Birmingham, Blackburn, Bradford, Manchester and Oldham, among many other places, all of which reflects trends that are sweeping through Europe. By the year 2050, which is really not that far away, the Pew Research Center estimates that Muslims, who are growing at more than twice the rate of non-Muslims, will reach 31% of Sweden, 20% of Germany, 18% of France, and about the same share in Britain. A shared language is also collapsing. There are now 1 million people in England who cannot speak English. There are 5.1 million people in my country whose main language is not English. Nearly 2 million school pupils in England now speak English as an additional language, not as their main language. No shared language means no shared national story, means no shared collective memory, which means no nation. And our sense of national identity is also crumbling. According to the official census in 2021, there are now 6 million people in my country who openly say they do not identify with a UK, British or English identity. Instead, they choose what the census calls a non-UK identity. In 2025 last year, Muslims in Britain were asked a simple question by a reputable pollster. Do you identify first and foremost with Islam, or do you identify first and foremost with your British, English or Scottish identity? 71% said they identify first and foremost with Islam. 71%. What we are seeing is the dire effects of a very specific policy that has been imposed on a nation with no democratic consent. Both the Labour Party and the centre-right Tory Party work together to impose a policy of mass, uncontrolled immigration, which reflected a new psychology that has taken over the ruling class, what the Canadian psychologist Gad Saad calls suicidal empathy. Suicidal empathy is what happens when politicians become so obsessed with showing empathy and tolerance to outsiders and minorities that they destroy their own nations in the process. That is what we are living through in Western nations today. We saw this most forcefully with Boris Johnson, a so-called conservative who flooded my country with 4 million migrants from outside of Europe. 90% of all immigration into Britain today comes from outside Europe, from radically different cultures. Only 1 in 5 of the people that Boris Johnson brought in came in on work visas. 1 in 5. We also see this mindset of suicidal empathy with the grooming gang scandal. That relates to the mass rape and sexual assault of white non-Muslim girls in my country by organized gangs of Pakistani Muslims. Suicidal empathy led politicians in my country to ignore that scandal for 30 years and look the other way. Because they were so obsessed with showing empathy to minorities, they sacrificed our own children on the altar of their liberal beliefs. And we see the same mindset with what's happening at our border with the small boats. Nearly 200,000, mainly young, Muslim, fighting-age men have entered Britain illegally since 2018. And on current trends, nearly 500,000 will enter the country illegally by the end of this decade. Nobody asked for this, nobody voted for it, but it's costing the British people up to £15 billion in accommodation costs alone, while putting women and girls at risk, such as the case of Rhiannon White, a young woman who was working at an asylum hotel and at the end of her shift walked home to see her child and was stabbed 20 times in the head with a screwdriver by an illegal migrant from Sudan. Nobody in the celebrity or political class talks about Rhiannon White. They talk about George Floyd, but they don't talk about Rhiannon White. So I'm here today to talk about Rhiannon White. Where are things heading if we do not change course? One pessimistic view has been put forward by Professor David Betts, who argues that Western nations are now entering what he calls a state of post-sovereign disorder. David Betts has argued that the conditions for civil conflict that he has identified in developing countries are now present in developed states, such as France and the UK. The relationship between politicians and voters is breaking down, and there is clear evidence of inter-ethnic conflict within our societies, such as the urban disturbances that we saw in a place such as Leicester between Hindus and Muslims. Leicester used to be held up as a success story, as an example of how diversity works. Nobody would say that today. An alternative is that we actually elect a government that will do what needs to be done in order to end the policy of mass migration and slow the pace of demographic change. The recipe or the ingredients will vary from one country to the next, but as I argue in the book, in the United Kingdom, I think the way forward is clear. We need to end the policy of mass uncontrolled immigration, which nobody voted for. We need to leave the European Convention on Human Rights, which is preventing us from deporting illegal migrants and foreign criminals from our country. We need to restrict all welfare benefits and stop giving welfare to people who are not British. We need to stop giving social housing subsidies to people who are not British. We need to ban the Muslim Brotherhood. We need to ban Sharia courts. We need to ban cousin marriage. And we need to return to an old-fashioned principle called national preference, which is that it's the law-abiding, tax-paying, hard-working British majority who should always be put first, not outsiders, not minorities, not foreigners who are consistently put ahead of our own people because of the mindset of suicidal empathy that has taken hold of our political class and our institutions. Thank you very much.